Eleanor had always believed that a lifetime of loyalty would secure her place in the family. Instead, she received an eviction notice and the cold stares of relatives who built their comfort on her ruin. Banished to a desolate coastal lighthouse with nothing but a canvas bag, they thought she would simply fade away into the freezing mist. Little did they know, breaking the rusted seal on a forgotten oak trunk wouldn't just open a door. It would awaken a past the entire town had spent 40 years desperately trying to bury. What Eleanor found inside wasn't glittering gold. It was a terrifyingly precise map of betrayals that would bring the untouchable pillars of her community to their knees. If you've ever been judged unfairly, if you've ever carried the weight of lies others told about you, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Eleanor does with this absolute truth will prove that it is never, ever too late to clear your name and reclaim your dignity. Welcome to While You Still Can. The heavy oak door slams shut. The brass lock clicks into place. Eleanor stands on the frost-covered porch. Behind her, the Vance family estate falls silent. They expect her to break. They wait for her to knock, to apologize, to beg for readmission into their comfortable, toxic hierarchy. She turns her back. Her leather boots crunch against the frozen gravel. She does not look over her shoulder. A person stripped of their home faces an immediate void. The world suddenly loses its boundaries. Eleanor walks down the long, elm-lined driveway. The iron gates of the property loom ahead. Passing through them marks the point of no return. She carries a single canvas travel bag. It holds 3 changes of clothes, a few essential tools, and a heavy sealed envelope. This envelope contains a promise made 20 years ago. The walk to the city limits takes 2 hours. The familiar streets feel alien. The glowing storefronts and bustling cafes belong to a life she just abandoned. She navigates the concrete grid with mechanical precision. Her destination is the Central Railway Terminal. The midnight locomotive waits on Platform 7. She purchases a one-way ticket with the last of her physical cash. The clerk slides the paper slip across the counter without making eye contact. Eleanor boards the train. The carriage is nearly empty. She chooses a seat by the window. The engine groans, and the steel wheels begin their rhythmic clattering against the tracks. The neon skyline of the city slowly dissolves into the dark. She presses her forehead against the cold glass. The physical separation is now in motion. The envelope in her coat pocket feels heavy. It is a deed to a plot of land at Blackwood Point. Her late grandfather, Arthur, transferred it to her name in secret. He knew the family dynamic. He foresaw this exact fracture. He told her to use the location only when the walls of the estate finally crushed her spirit. Today, those walls collapsed. She chose exile over subjugation. The train travels to the coast for 11 hours. The landscape outside the window undergoes a brutal transformation. The manicured suburbs give way to sprawling, industrial wastelands. These eventually fade into barren, windswept moors. By dawn, the land surrenders to the jagged coastline of the Atlantic. The sky turns the color of bruised iron. The temperature drops significantly, and the smell of raw salt fills the carriage. The locomotive halts at a nameless coastal depot. Eleanor steps onto the damp wooden platform. The air here is sharp. It smells of ocean spray and freezing mist. The train departs, leaving her in profound silence. Civilization ends at this platform. The next phase of the journey requires a different mode of transit. A local fisherman idles in a rusted pickup truck near the station. Eleanor approaches him. She offers him $50 for a ride down the coastal road. He nods silently. She climbs into the worn passenger seat. The truck smells of stale tobacco and old canvas. They drive for an hour. The asphalt road quickly deteriorates into a gravel path running dangerously close to the sharp cliffs. The elevation rises and falls with the rocky shoreline. The truck engine whines in protest. Dense fog rolls in from the sea, swallowing the road. The driver stops at a washed-out section of the path. The dark ocean below crashes against jagged black rocks. The truck can go no further. Eleanor gathers her bag. She steps out into the freezing mist. The driver turns the vehicle around and disappears down the coast. She is now utterly alone. The final 3 miles must be covered on foot. The cliffside trail is steep and unmaintained. Wet stones and coastal brush create a treacherous path. Eleanor adjusts the strap of her bag. The canvas cuts into her shoulder. Her muscles burn with every step. The physical exertion forces her mind to stay in the present. There is no room for grief. Survival requires absolute focus. The fog grows thicker. The roar of the ocean blocks out all other sound. She navigates using a hand-drawn map sketched on the back of the deed. Arthur's instructions are precise. Walk 3 miles past the ruined pier. Find the blackened coastal pine. Turn west toward the cliff edge. She spots the blackened pine. Lightning struck it decades ago, leaving a jagged scar down its trunk. She alters her course westward. The sea wind becomes punishing. The salty air stings her lungs. Her hands grow numb inside her leather gloves. The isolation of Blackwood Point is not just geographical. It is a physical barrier designed to keep the world away. After another hour of walking, the fog momentarily parts. A structure emerges from the gray landscape. It is an abandoned lighthouse made of dark, weathered stone, attached to a decaying keeper's cottage. It sits on the edge of a sheer drop, overlooking the violent, endless ocean. The property has been abandoned for 40 years. Coastal vines choke the front steps. The windows are shuttered with heavy wooden planks. The chimney is cold. The elements have battered the exterior, turning the stone a deep, silver gray. It looks less like a house and more like a natural fortress jutting out of the bedrock. Eleanor drops her bag on the damp earth. She stands before the structure. The journey is over. The familiar world of the Vance estate is gone. The noise, the expectations, the constant psychological warfare. All of it has been left behind in the city. She has traded a golden cage for a desolate coastal fortress. She approaches the front porch. The wooden floorboards groan under her weight. A heavy iron padlock secures the main door. It is rusted solid. The key Arthur gave her is still taped inside the envelope. She reaches into her pocket. The metal is freezing against her skin. She stands at the threshold of her new reality. The past is dead. The unknown waits behind the heavy oak door. She pushes past the rotting front door of the cottage and navigates the dark, empty rooms. But the true secret is not in the living quarters. She finds a narrow stone staircase leading down into the earth. Eleanor stands in the damp, lightless cellar beneath the abandoned lighthouse keeper's cottage. The air tastes of raw salt, crushed limestone, and deep decay. Her kerosene lantern casts trembling, elongated shadows against the weeping stone walls. Cold water drips somewhere in the absolute dark. The hollow sound measures the passing seconds. She abandoned her entire life, her city, and her remaining family to find this exact spot. Before her stands a second, heavy oak door. A heavy wax seal bears the crest of a forgotten family line. It sits thick and imposing over a rusted iron padlock. 50 years of absolute silence press against the wood. The door is severely warped from decades of relentless coastal humidity. Massive iron hinges flake brown, powdery rust onto the uneven dirt floor. She reaches out. Her bare fingers brush the freezing metal of the lock. The chill bites instantly through her skin. The wax is incredibly brittle. It has darkened from a vibrant royal crimson to the dull color of dried earth. Eleanor presses her thumb directly against the center of the crest. A tiny, sharp crack splinters across the surface. She applies more pressure. The seal shatters completely. Flakes of ancient wax fall like dead leaves. They scatter across the scuffed toes of her leather boots. Now, the padlock remains. She retrieves a heavy, forged iron key from her deep coat pocket. The metal is warm from her own body heat. She inserts it into the jagged keyhole. It resists immediately. Decades of rust have fused the internal brass tumblers. She grips the heavy lock with her left hand. She forces the key clockwise with her right. Metal grinds viciously against metal. A sharp, high-pitched squeal echoes in the confined room. The mechanism finally yields with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The lock falls open. It strikes the stone floorboards with a dull thud. Eleanor pushes the door. It groans loudly, scraping a deep crescent moon into the dirt. The hidden room is suffocatingly small. It holds only one object. A massive, flat-topped oak trunk sits dead in the center. Thick brass bindings wrap securely around its edges. They are bright green with heavy oxidation. Dust covers the lid like a thick, gray woolen blanket. She steps closer. Her breathing sounds unnaturally loud in the tight space. She wipes the dust away with her forearm. The wood beneath is dark, scarred, and heavily grained. Two thick leather straps secure the front panel. The leather is stiff, white with mold, and deeply cracked. She unbuckles them. The material fights her hands. It threatens to snap in half. Finally, the brass tongues pull free from the holes. She places both hands under the heavy, overhanging lid. She lifts with her legs. The hinges scream. The distinct smell of trapped time violently escapes the trunk. It is an overwhelming mix of dried lavender, rotting paper, and sharp mothballs. Eleanor shines her lantern directly inside. The top layer reveals neatly folded fabrics. Heavy velvet curtains lie perfectly stacked. Their once vibrant emerald color has faded entirely along the sharp creases. She lifts the heavy fabric. The velvet feels terribly rough, completely stripped of its former luxurious softness. Beneath the curtains sit several delicate porcelain teacups. They are individually wrapped in yellowed, brittle newspaper. The printed headlines date back exactly 5 decades. She unwraps one cup carefully. A delicate, hand-painted floral pattern wraps around the thin rim. A deep hairline fracture runs straight down its side. She sets it gently on the floor. These are mere domestic illusions. They are a carefully constructed facade meant to hide the actual truth. She digs deeper. Her hands move past moth-eaten woolen blankets and heavily tarnished silverware. The trunk seems physically endless. Her bare knuckles scrape painfully against the rough, unfinished wood of the interior walls. She removes a heavy, silver-backed hand mirror. The glass is completely clouded by time. It reflects only a blurred, ghostly silhouette of her face. The bottom of the trunk finally appears empty. Just bare, horizontal oak planks. Eleanor pauses. Her eyes scan the interior. The physical dimensions feel entirely wrong. The exterior depth of the trunk simply does not match the interior space. She presses her palms flat against the wooden bottom. She pushes down hard with her body weight. Nothing gives. She runs her sensitive fingertips slowly along the dark edges. She searches for any microscopic gap. Her right index finger catches on a tiny, almost invisible groove. It is perfectly hidden beneath the bottom right brass corner fitting. She presses the groove inward. A sharp, mechanical click breaks the heavy silence. The wooden panel pops up a fraction of an inch. Her heart accelerates. She slides her short nails under the newly lifted edge. The false bottom is surprisingly heavy. She pulls it entirely free and sets it aside. A shallow, hidden compartment reveals itself. The air inside this secondary vault is perfectly preserved. No dust has ever touched this specific space. An entirely different scent rises up. It is the sharp, undeniable metallic tang of dried ink, old leather, and sealing wax. 3 distinct objects lie in the shallow recess. They rest on a pristine bed of unfaded black silk. The first object is a small rectangular wooden box. It is intricately carved from dark mahogany. Eleanor opens the tiny brass latch. A single lock of coarse hair rests inside. It is tied tightly with a pale blue ribbon. The hair is striking silver. She closes the box instantly. The emotional weight of recognizing that color burns her fingers. The second object is a heavy gold pocket watch. The crystal glass face is completely shattered. The delicate gold hands are frozen permanently at 3 minutes past midnight. The thick gold casing is severely dented on one side. It bears the undeniable marks of a violent, blunt impact. She traces the deep dent with her thumb. The cold metal offers zero comfort. The final object commands her total attention. It is a thick, oversized ledger. The cover is bound in cracked black leather. A thin leather strap holds it tightly closed. No lock secures it. The true danger lies entirely in the contents, not the binding. Eleanor lifts the ledger. It is shockingly heavy. The paper edges are thick and unevenly cut. She unties the dry strap. The heavy cover falls open. The paper inside is crisp and white. Neatly written, vertical columns of numbers fill the very first page. Specific names accompany the large figures. Exact dates are meticulously recorded beside them. The black ink handwriting is sharp, aggressive, and highly angular. It is instantly familiar. It is the exact handwriting of the man who systematically destroyed her life. She turns the heavy page. The ink remains dark black. Zero fading has occurred in the sealed darkness. The columns continue endlessly. These are clearly not standard financial records. They are a detailed, geographical map of betrayals. Next to specific prominent names, small red check marks appear. Dense notes are scribbled in the narrow margins. They detail exact bribe amounts, specific blackmail threats, and forced silences. Eleanor's eyes frantically scan the lines. She finds her own family name halfway down the 3rd page. A bright red mark sits aggressively beside it. The handwritten note next to it is terrifyingly brief. It dictates a precise, step-by-step plan for their complete social ruin. Her hands begin to shake uncontrollably. The heavy ledger slips slightly. She grips the binding tighter. The sharp edge of the thick paper cuts deep into her thumb. A small, bright drop of blood wells up instantly. It falls directly onto the yellowed page. The bright crimson contrasts violently with the stark black ink. She does not wipe it away. The sudden physical pain grounds her racing mind. The stale air in the cellar feels suddenly thinner. She looks back down at the shattered gold watch and the small mahogany box. The disparate pieces of the puzzle snap violently together. This trunk was never a sentimental tomb for lost memories. It was a highly secure vault for leverage. She reaches back into the hidden compartment. Her fingers brush against something cold, tucked in the furthest corner. It is a ring, a massive, heavy signet ring cast in dull, unpolished iron. The engraved crest matches the shattered wax seal on the door perfectly. Eleanor picks it up. The metal is exceptionally rough. The edges of the deep engraving are sharp enough to cut. Beneath where the ring lay, a small manila envelope rests flat against the black silk. The paper is dangerously brittle. The adhesive flap dried out decades ago. Eleanor opens it with extreme care. 5 black and white photographs slide smoothly into her open palm. The first image shows a group of men standing before a grand municipal building. They are smiling broadly. Their postures are relaxed and confident. Eleanor recognizes every single face. They are the untouchable pillars of the community, the exact men who collectively turned their backs on her family. The man standing dead center wears the iron signet ring on his right hand. She moves to the second photograph. It is taken at night. The lighting is incredibly poor, but the profile of the recipient is unmistakable. It is the local magistrate. He is accepting a thick envelope from the man with the ring. The camera captured the exact, undeniable transaction of her family's ruin. Eleanor gathers the photographs. She places them flat inside the ledger. The brittle paper crinkles loudly. She looks at the scattered, chaotic contents of the trunk. The rough velvet, the cracked porcelain, the shattered watch, the damning ledger, the iron ring. Each object holds a distinct, undeniable texture of deception. The damp, freezing cold of the cellar no longer bothers her. A massive, radiating heat builds deep in her chest. It is not chaotic anger. It is absolute, terrifying clarity. These artifacts are no longer just forgotten objects. They are loaded weapons. She carefully repacks the false bottom with the decoy items. She leaves the ledger, the photographs, and the heavy iron ring out. She wraps them tightly in one of the faded velvet curtains. The thick fabric provides a perfect protective layer. She ties the tight bundle with the leather strap salvaged from the trunk's exterior. The resulting package is compact. It is incredibly heavy with undeniable truth. Eleanor picks up the lantern. The kerosene is running dangerously low. The yellow flame sputters and coughs. She does not close the heavy trunk lid. The secrets are finally out. The dark space can remain empty forever. She turns toward the heavy wooden door. The rusted lock lies dead on the floor. She steps cleanly over it. The bundle rests securely under her arm. The long ascent back to the surface awaits. A single, unverified sentence can dismantle a human life. It requires no physical weapon. It leaves no visible bruises. 40 years ago, Magistrate Vance stood on the limestone steps of the town hall. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. He looked over the assembled crowd. He pointed a steady, manicured finger at Eleanor. He spoke exactly 12 words. She has compromised the integrity of our community for her own gain. He offered no evidence. He presented no documents. He simply leveraged the immense weight of his inherited authority. Vance owned the land beneath the town. He controlled the grain silos. He held the mortgages for half the families standing in that square. His word was the absolute currency of their daily survival. Eleanor was a respected archivist. She preserved their histories. She knew their lineages. But in that singular moment, her past ceased to exist. The anatomy of a ruined reputation is precise. It mimics a biological infection. The first symptom is the death of eye contact. Eleanor walked down the main avenue that afternoon. The blacksmith suddenly found his anvil fascinating. The baker wiped down an already spotless counter. Neighbors of 30 years suddenly discovered urgent business in the opposite direction. Silence rushed into the spaces where greetings used to live. By the second day, the physical boundaries began to shift. A radius of invisible quarantine formed around her. If she entered the grocer's shop, the aisles emptied. People did not run. They drifted away with practiced, terrifying casualness. The air around her turned cold. She became a ghost, haunting her own life. The mechanism of social isolation relies on complicity. It requires the active participation of the silent majority. Her closest friend, Margaret, stopped visiting. Margaret did not act out of malice. She acted out of a primal instinct for self-preservation. To stand beside the accused was to share the accusation. Association equaled guilt. The townspeople performed a rapid, silent calculus. They weighed their affection for Eleanor against their reliance on Magistrate Vance. Economics triumphed over loyalty. It always does. Within 1 week, the economic strangulation commenced. Eleanor bound books and restored manuscripts for a living. The cancellation letters arrived in neat, identical envelopes. The wording was always polite. The excuses were uniformly vague. A change in budget. A shift in priorities. No one mentioned the scene at the town hall. The true reason remained buried under layers of civil bureaucracy. Her income evaporated. The community established a new normal. Eleanor's name was quietly excised from the town council registry. Her assigned pew at the Sunday assembly was given to a newlywed couple. The postman stopped walking up her garden path. He left her mail in a rusted box at the very edge of the property line. He refused to cross the threshold. Her home transformed from a sanctuary into a designated exclusion zone. Time is the ultimate weapon of the ostracized. Weeks bled into months. The original accusation lost its specific details. Nobody remembered exactly what Vance claimed she had done. The lack of facts made the rumor infinitely adaptable. In the absence of truth, imagination took control. The missing funds from the parish? Eleanor must have taken them. The sudden illness of the butcher's horse? Eleanor walked past the stable that morning. She became the designated receptacle for every communal misfortune. Generational transmission cemented her status. Children who were not even born on the day of the town hall meeting learned the new rules. They were taught to cross the street when approaching her iron gate. They dared each other to touch her rusted mailbox. She was no longer a woman. She was a cautionary tale. She was the monster in the woods, living right in the center of their pristine neighborhood. Eleanor adapted. Survival demanded a complete restructuring of her existence. She altered her circadian rhythms. She visited the public well at 4 a.m. She gathered fallen wood under the cover of a moonless sky. She learned to navigate the world in the negative spaces left by others. She mapped the blind spots of the town. She became a master of shadows. The psychological toll of this existence is absolute. The human brain is wired for connection. When you sever that connection, the mind begins to devour itself. Eleanor spent the first 5 years fighting the phantom of guilt. When an entire society treats you as a criminal, you begin to interrogate your own memories. She replayed every interaction. She searched for the crime she did not commit. This is the cruelest phase of isolation. The victim begins to assist the executioner. Eventually, the confusion hardened into something else. It crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. She stopped looking at the town. She turned her attention inward. She possessed something they did not. She possessed the absolute certainty of her own innocence. The town had built a fortress of lies to keep her out. She built a fortress of truth to keep herself intact. The physical environment mirrored her internal state. The ivy consumed the brickwork of her house. The oak trees blocked the windows. Nature reclaimed the space the community had abandoned. Her isolation was now visible from the surrounding hills. A dark green anomaly in a sea of manicured lawns. For 40 years, Magistrate Vance's 12 words dictated the reality of 1,000 people. He died a celebrated patriarch. A bronze plaque was erected in his honor. The town continued to operate on the foundation of his unchallenged authority. They built their marriages, their businesses, and their moral superiority on the bedrock of Eleanor's exile. They believed the narrative was settled. They believed history was written in permanent ink. They forgot about the nature of archivists. They forgot that Eleanor spent her entire life preserving the things people tried to throw away. The town square remained perfectly swept. The bronze plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun. But beneath the silence, beneath the 40 years of averted gazes and whispered warnings, the actual past was waiting to be exhumed. Ink possesses a courage that the human voice lacks. Vocal cords tighten under the gaze of an angry crowd. Lungs refuse to draw the breath needed for a defense. Paper, however, accepts the burden of truth without a single flinch. Eleanor brought the heavy bundle up from the cellar. She spread the brittle pages across the scarred oak table. Dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through the salt-stained cottage window. She was not looking at mere letters. She was looking at the exhumed conscience of an entire town. 40 years ago, a collective decision was made. Silence became the currency of survival. The people who destroyed her did not act out of malice. They acted out of a profound, paralyzing conformity. The proof lay right here, captured in fading black ink. The first document was a diary bound in cracked green leather. The handwriting belonged to Clara. Clara had been Eleanor's shadow, her confidant, the keeper of her childhood secrets. The entry was dated the night of the autumn festival. This was the exact night Edward had orchestrated the theft and planted the evidence in Eleanor's belongings. Clara had seen it all. The diary detailed the event with sickening clarity. Clara wrote about standing behind the velvet curtain in the community hall. She watched Edward slip the heavy silver heirloom into Eleanor's coat pocket. Clara noted the smug twist of Edward's lips. She recorded the exact time. Yet, Clara never stepped out from behind that curtain. The diary explained her paralysis. Edward's father owned the mill. Clara's father worked the timber saws. A single word of truth would have severed her family's livelihood. Clara traded her best friend for a warm hearth and a guaranteed dowry. She poured her guilt into the pages of a hidden book instead of screaming the truth into the crowded hall. Reading this, Eleanor felt no shock. The betrayal was a cold, calculated transaction. Clara chose the safety of the herd over the isolation of justice. Eleanor pushed the green diary aside. She picked up a stack of official memorandums. They were stamped with the seal of the local magistrate's office. The signature at the bottom belonged to Julian, the town's chief archivist. Julian was a man obsessed with order. He lived for ledgers, dates, and verifiable facts. During the investigation 40 years ago, Julian noticed a fatal flaw in Edward's testimony. Edward claimed to be at the tavern during the hour the heirloom went missing. Julian's own meticulously kept town logs proved Edward was actually in the restricted archives, signing out a map of the estate. Julian wrote an official memorandum detailing this discrepancy. He presented it to the presiding judge. The next document in the stack was that very memorandum. It was torn cleanly in half. Julian had taped the pieces back together. Beneath the mended tear, he had written a private addendum. The judge had ordered him to destroy the document. The judge was Edward's uncle. Julian wrote about the cold sweat on his neck. He wrote about the heavy oak doors of the courthouse closing him in. He was a man of records, not a man of action. He chose to preserve the truth in a hidden box rather than present it in an open court. Julian's complicity was born of institutional cowardice. He believed the system was sacred, even when the men running it were corrupt. He documented the rot, but he refused to cut it out. Eleanor traced the jagged line of tape across the paper. The banality of this evil was suffocating. Her life was ruined not by a grand conspiracy, but by a clerk too frightened to lose his pension. The heaviest piece of evidence lay at the bottom of the chest. It was a letter written on heavy, cream-colored parchment. The wax seal was broken. The sender was Reverend Thomas, the moral compass of the valley. The letter was addressed to Eleanor. It had never been mailed. Reverend Thomas knew the truth. He had taken Edward's confession in the dim light of the chapel 3 days after Eleanor was banished. Edward had wept. He admitted to the frame-up. He admitted to his jealousy of Eleanor's rising influence in the guild. The Reverend's letter was a masterpiece of twisted logic. He wrote to Eleanor, begging for her spiritual forgiveness from afar. He explained his decision to keep Edward's confession a secret. The town was fragile. A scandal involving Edward's prominent family would fracture the community. The mill would close. Families would starve. Reverend Thomas decided that one broken girl was a tragic but necessary price for collective peace. He sacrificed Eleanor on the altar of social stability. He convinced himself that hiding the truth was a holy act of preservation. The letter was drenched in self-righteous pity. The Reverend asked God to comfort Eleanor in her exile, completely ignoring the fact that he held the key to her salvation. Eleanor stood up. The air in the cottage felt thin. She paced the length of the wooden floorboards. These documents mapped the anatomy of a ruined reputation. They revealed a terrifying aspect of human nature. People do not stay silent because they are inherently evil. They stay silent because the cost of speaking is immediate and personal, while the cost of silence is borne by someone else. The town bound itself together through shared guilt. Every person who looked away at the market, every official who altered a record, every neighbor who whispered the false rumor, they all became accomplices. They hated Eleanor not for the crime she supposedly committed. They hated her because her continued existence was a walking reminder of their own moral failure. To admit her innocence was to admit their own monstrous cowardice. It was easier to brand her a thief and banish her to the fringes of society. Eleanor walked back to the table. She looked at the scattered papers. The ink was dry. The hands that wrote these words were old, trembling, or dead. An unfamiliar sensation began to bloom in her chest. It was not sorrow. Sorrow had burned away decades ago. It was not even rage. Rage was chaotic and blinding. This feeling was absolute crystalline clarity. For 40 years, she had carried the weight of a phantom crime. She had allowed their lie to dictate her posture, her location, her very identity. She had hidden in the shadows, believing the world had rejected her. The truth was entirely different. The world had not rejected her. The world had hidden from her. Clara's diary, Julian's torn memorandum, the Reverend's cowardly letter. These were not weapons used against her. They were shields the town had built to protect themselves from the glare of their own corruption. Eleanor gathered the documents. She stacked them neatly. The parchment felt rough against her calloused fingertips. She ran her hand over the leather covers and the broken wax seals. These papers were raw materials. They held the power to dismantle the false history of the valley. The silence of the past 40 years was a fragile glass structure. It relied entirely on the assumption that the evidence was buried forever. It relied on the assumption that the exiled girl would simply fade into the earth and be forgotten. Eleanor was not forgotten. She was standing in the center of the room, holding the undeniable proof of her innocence. The documents were heavy. They possessed a physical weight that anchored her to the present moment. The isolation of her exile was over. The period of passive endurance had reached its absolute end. She looked toward the small mirror hanging by the door. The reflection showed a woman, weathered by time and harsh winters. Her eyes, however, held a new, terrifying light. She knew exactly what she possessed. She held the documented truth. Now, she needed a way to make them look at it. She needed to craft a reckoning they could not ignore. Ink fades over 4 decades. Paper turns brittle. Can fragile documents dismantle a fortress of public respect built over a lifetime? Edward held the town's admiration like a shield. Eleanor held a stack of yellowed letters. The collision was inevitable. She did not choose modern clothes for this day. The old chest offered garments from the era of her exile. She selected a heavy, charcoal gray wool coat. Its cut belonged to the past. The fabric smelled of dried lavender and coal dust. She pinned the most damning letter directly to the lapel. It was not a hidden weapon. It was a badge. She found a silver brooch, tarnished black. She fastened it at her throat. The silver bound the collar tight. She tied her silver hair back with a faded silk ribbon. Every item anchored her to the truth of that forgotten year. She looked in the cracked mirror. The woman staring back was no longer a victim. She was a living archive. She folded the remaining documents into a leather satchel. The strap cut into her shoulder. The weight felt right. The brass buckles clicked shut with a sharp, metallic finality. The walk to the town square took 20 minutes. The morning air bit at her cheeks. Cobblestones shifted under her heavy leather boots. People passed by. Eyes slid over her outdated silhouette. No one recognized the outcast. She moved with measured steps. Panic tried to rise in her chest. She forced her breathing to slow. Inhale for 4 counts. Exhale for 4. The town had modernized. Glass storefronts replaced wooden stalls. Yet the layout remained identical. The roots of power never change. She heard the low hum of the market crowd ahead. The central square bustled with weekend activity. Vendors arranged winter vegetables on wooden tables. Citizens clustered near the central stone fountain. Edward stood by the water basin. He wore a tailored navy suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He was shaking hands, smiling, dispensing advice. He was the undisputed pillar of the community. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the plaza. She did not rush. She observed his gestures, the confident tilt of his head, the patronizing pat on a young merchant's shoulder. 40 years of practiced benevolence. He radiated an aura of absolute untouchability. The town fed on his confidence. They reflected his smiled back at him. She stepped into the open space. Her charcoal coat absorbed the morning light. She walked directly toward the fountain. She did not weave through the crowd. She moved in a straight, uncompromising line. The crowd naturally parted. Her unnatural stillness commanded attention. Conversations died down. Heads turned. The ambient noise of the market dropped by half. Edward noticed the shift in the crowd's rhythm. He looked up. His smile froze. Recognition hit his eyes like a physical blow. The tailored suit suddenly looked stiff. The color drained from his face. His hand dropped from the merchant's shoulder. He stood paralyzed against the stone rim of the fountain. Eleanor stopped 3 paces from him. She did not raise her voice. She unclasped the leather satchel. The metal buckle echoed loudly in the sudden silence. She pulled out the first ledger. The cover was bound in cracked red leather. She held it up. The morning sun caught the faded gold lettering. Edward stepped back. His hand gripped the edge of the stone fountain. His knuckles turned white. August 12th, she said. Her voice carried across the silent square. It was clear and devoid of anger. You signed the transfer orders. She dropped the ledger onto the flat stone edge of the fountain. It landed with a heavy thud. Dust motes danced in the air above it. She reached into the satchel again. She pulled out a bundle of letters bound in rough twine. September 3rd. You instructed the committee to bury the structural reports. She placed the letters next to the ledger. Edward opened his mouth. No sound came out. The benevolent patriarch vanished. A trapped man stood in his place. His eyes darted toward the exits of the square. He found only walls of staring faces. Eleanor produced a single sheet of parchment. The official seal of the municipality sat in the bottom corner. The red wax was chipped but intact. October 1st. The false testimonies were notarized. She laid the parchment flat on the stone. The evidence formed a neat, undeniable geometry of betrayal. The crowd pushed closer. Neighbors stared at the documents. The handwriting was unmistakable. Edward's distinct, looping signature covered the pages. Eleanor unpinned the letter from her lapel. She held it out to the closest bystander. The local baker, a man who had praised Edward minutes before, hesitated. He wiped his hands on his apron. He took the fragile paper. His eyes scanned the blue ink. His expression shifted from confusion to shock. He looked at Edward. The baker's jaw tightened. He passed the letter to the woman beside him. The silence in the square grew heavy. It was the sound of a collective illusion shattering. Eleanor did not demand apologies. She did not list her personal grievances. She did not cry. She simply built a monument of evidence on the cold stone. Edward's chest heaved. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the faces of his neighbors. Disgust replaced their former admiration. The foundation of his life crumbled in less than 3 minutes. The 40-year gap closed. The past devoured his present. Eleanor closed the empty satchel. She looked Edward directly in the eyes. The fear in his gaze was absolute. His reputation was unraveling in real time. He was entirely stripped of his armor. She turned her back on him. She did not wait for the town's verbal verdict. The truth was delivered. The physical proof remained on the fountain. The crowd parted for her again. This time, they did not look away. They watched her with a mixture of awe and fear. They stepped back to give her a wide berth. She walked back toward the edge of town. Her boots struck the cobblestones with a steady, rhythmic beat. The heavy charcoal coat disappeared down the narrow street. Behind her, the murmurs of the crowd finally erupted into a deafening roar. The heavy oak doors of the magistrate's chamber closed. The sound echoed with the finality of a vault ceiling. The settlement document lay on the polished table. 3 signatures had just rewritten 40 years of family history. Edward, the architect of her exile, had finally capitulated. His hand had trembled as he signed the formal retraction. The legal decree was absolute. It restored Eleanor's rightful ownership of the estate. It mandated a public publication of the truth in the provincial registry. It legally dismantled the fiction that had kept her in the shadows. Eleanor picked up her copy of the decree. She felt no sudden rush of euphoria. Vindication is a cold metal. It does not warm the hands that hold it. It merely provides a shield. She walked out of the building. The town square, the site of her recent confrontation, was quiet. The legal victory was secured. Now came the far more complex battlefield. The aftermath of truth. The shift in the social tide was immediate. The family tree began to shake. Relatives who had treated her name as a curse suddenly found their voices. The mail began arriving 3 days later. Heavy envelopes piled up on the entryway console of her reclaimed home. First came the letters from the cousins. Then came messages from nieces and nephews. These were children who had only known her as a dark family myth. The psychology of their outreach was transparent. The outcast was now the victor. The impoverished exile was now the matriarch holding the deeds. Their letters were masterpieces of deflection. They blamed Edward's influence. They cited the confusion of the times. They spoke of missing her. They offered everything except genuine accountability. They wanted a seamless reunion. They expected the passage of time to act as an automatic pardon. Eleanor did not burn the letters. She categorized them. Forgiveness was no longer a default setting in her life. It was a highly restricted territory. She had spent 4 decades building a life in the freezing wind of their rejection. She would not let them walk into her warmth without passing through the fire. She summoned her legal counsel. Together, they drafted a singular, uniform response. It was not a letter of welcome. It was a manifesto of boundaries. A courier delivered this document to 15 different households. The conditions for re-entry into Eleanor's life were rigid. They were non-negotiable. Condition 1 demanded absolute historical accuracy. Any relative wishing to speak with her had to write down their specific role in her ostracism. No vague apologies. No shifting the blame to the family collective. They had to name their own silence. They had to document their own complicity. Condition 2 dismantled any financial expectations. The restored estate and its assets were placed into an irrevocable, blind trust. The trust was designated for historical preservation and legal defense funds for the wrongfully accused. Eleanor removed money from the family equation entirely. She would not be a bank for guilty consciences. She would not allow greed to masquerade as familial love. Condition 3 established a timeline. Trust would be measured in years, not holiday dinners. There would be no immediate invitations to the estate. There would be no tearful embraces. Initial contact would be restricted to written correspondence. If a relative maintained respectful, honest communication for 2 years, they might earn a brief, supervised meeting in a neutral public space. The response from the family was fractured. 9 relatives never replied. The boundaries were too high. The mirror held up to their behavior was too harsh. They retreated back into their comfortable illusions. Eleanor felt a profound relief at their silence. The trash had taken itself out. 6 relatives, however, accepted the terms. Among them was Clara, a grandniece. Clara was 24. She had grown up breathing the poisoned air of the family's lies. The public revelation in the town square had shattered her worldview. She did not write an excuse. She wrote a devastatingly honest account of her own inherited prejudice. She admitted to repeating the lies. She asked for nothing but the opportunity to learn. Eleanor accepted Clara's submission. She waived the 2-year waiting period. This was not a capitulation. It was a strategic decision. Clara represented the future. She was the breaking point of the generational curse. Their first meeting took place in the estate's library. Rain lashed against the tall glass windows. The room smelled of old leather and damp earth. Eleanor did not offer a warm hug. She offered a cup of black tea. Clara sat across from her, nervous and alert. Eleanor did not speak of her pain. She spoke of mechanics. She laid out the anatomy of a smear campaign. She explained how conformity breeds within a closed group. She detailed the exact process by which a lie becomes a shared truth through the simple act of repetition. She walked Clara to the heavy wooden table. She did not show her the old chest. She showed her the newly bound volumes of court transcripts. She presented the original forged documents alongside the legal retractions. "Do not trust blood," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "Trust evidence. Trust action. Blood is merely a biological accident. Integrity is a daily choice." She taught Clara how to read between the lines of family lore. She explained the danger of groupthink. She showed her how to identify the subtle signs of manipulation. She was not just telling a story. She was transferring a survival skill. Eleanor handed Clara a heavy, blank leather journal. "You are the archivist now," Eleanor instructed. "Record your own truth. Question every narrative handed down to you. When the family tries to rewrite history again, and they will, you will hold the pen." Clara took the journal. Her hands were steady. The transfer of power was complete. Eleanor looked out the window at the sprawling grounds of her reclaimed property. The legal battle was won. The boundaries were set. The perimeter was secure. She had not just survived the exile. She had weaponized it. She had turned her isolation into a fortress and her suffering into a curriculum. The cycle of blind obedience was finally broken. A new lineage of critical thought had just begun. I am deeply grateful you stayed with Eleanor through her entire journey, from being destroyed by a collective lie to standing in absolute truth and weaponizing her exile. If her story touched something deep in your heart, if you've ever wondered whether it's truly too late to take back what was stolen from you, leave one word in the comments describing how you would feel if you finally proved your innocence to everyone who doubted you. Eleanor's story proves an undeniable truth. Blood is merely a biological accident, but integrity is a daily choice. The truth does not have an expiration date. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that reputations can be restored and that the darkest isolation can lead directly to the most powerful triumph. Welcome to our community of people who refuse to let false accusations define them forever. Thank you for listening, while you still can.